So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome everyone to this introduction to document accessibility and training on accessibility considerations for maps and data visualizations. My name is Tyler Winters, and I am an accessibility specialist here at MSFW Consulting. Also with me here today is accessibility specialist Melissa Romanato. She's going to be keeping an eye on the chat for me while I do the presentation today. So the goal of today's webinar is to provide tips and best practices for the design and creation of static, non-interactive maps and other data visualizations such as charts and graphs. Before we get to that, though, we do have a few housekeeping items to mention. One, these sessions are being recorded. They will be made available for you to view for a later date. So if you have a question that maybe didn't get answered, or maybe a question later on, after the presentation, you could feel free to find this video and go back and review it. Also, if you could, please mute your mics to avoid any unnecessary distractions during the training. And if you do have questions along the way, feel free to type those into the chat, and we'll try to get to those as soon as we can. Also, the state of Iowa has office hours on Wednesdays, which we host. So if you have any questions, about this training or any past trainings or anything that you're working on related to accessibility, feel free to come to those sessions and ask your questions at that time. It's kind of an open format, so we introduce ourselves, let you guys ask questions, and we answer them. Okay, so before we dive in, let's take a quick look at some of the key features we'll be covering in this training. Some of these features, they apply to both maps and data visualizations, while others are more specific to just maps. But either way, they all play an important role in making your visuals clear, accessible, and easy to understand. So we'll be focusing on things like scale, fonts, and color contrast, labels, line styles, symbols and patterns, background images, headings, directional arrows, scale bar, legend, and alternate text and alternate formats. Some of these things you're already familiar with. We've talked about them in previous trainings, but they still apply to maps and data visualizations. So throughout the training, you're going to see examples included on most slides. These examples come from Iowa State documents and from the University of Iowa's website. So you'll get a mix of real-world applications that you may already be used to seeing. And hopefully by the end of this session, you'll have a solid understanding of how to design maps and data visualizations that are more accessible, user-friendly, and effective for all audiences. So, all right, let's talk about scale, because when it comes to accessible maps and data visualizations, getting the scale right really does make a huge difference. So you want to first think about how much information you're showing at once. If there's too much going on, the map or chart can become overwhelming, and it can be hard to process that information effectively. So the goal is to keep it clear and meaningful, and you want to make sure that the map is not cluttered with too much information. So next, you want to consider how your audience is viewing that map. So, a map that looks great on a desktop might be somewhat of a nightmare to navigate on a phone because small screens make details harder to see. And legibility across all devices is the key goal here. So some of the things you can do to address this are you want to simplify wherever possible. So highlight only the most important data points or trends on the map. And also make sure text labels, any icons, any markers, make sure those stay readable at different zoom levels and screen sizes. So you want to test that before you send this out and finalize it. Just because, so when you're intentional about scale, you're not just improving readability, you're making the experience more inclusive for everyone, no matter how they access your content. Okay, so now that we've covered scale, let's move on to fonts because choosing the right fonts can make your maps and data visualizations much easier to read. Should be an obvious. But to start, it's best to use only one or a limited number of fonts throughout your design because consistency, it helps users focus on the information being presented rather than being, distracted by too many visual styles. So you also want to ensure that the font text is as large as possible. A good rule of thumb usually is to use at least 10-point font or larger. Um, but when designing for accessibility, something to keep in mind is that larger is always better, because this is especially important for users with low vision, or those viewing your content on mobile devices, like we mentioned before. So additionally, you'll want to make sure that you choose the right type of font. So you want to stick to sans serif fonts. Those are fonts like Aptos, Calibri, or Arial. Typically, those work the best because they're clean, they're easy to read, and they don't have any of those extra decorative strokes that can make text harder to process or that sometimes end up blending into the background. So a few other key things to keep in mind when it comes to fonts are ensuring sufficient contrast between the text and the background for readability. We're kind of getting into the color contrast here. And also you'll want to avoid you'll want to avoid putting your text in all uppercase letters because that can be harder to read. And then using proper spacing between letters, words, and lines to make the text more legible. It's a lot easier to read a lot of words when there's enough spacing in between them. So just by keeping, these font style tips in mind, you'll ensure that your maps and data visualizations are accessible and easier to understand for a wider audience. Okay, so I mentioned it on the last slide briefly. Uh, color contrast. Um, it's super important because without it, maps and data visualizations can be difficult, if not impossible, for some users to read. Um, I mentioned it before, we've mentioned color contrast, I think, in every single training so far. It just carries over and it is so important. And it's probably one of the main things that is in violation most of the times. It's easy to forget. It's easy to get wrong. So we're going to kind of harp on it on pretty much every training from here on out. But when it comes to color contrast, the key is to keep sufficient contrast between your text color and background color. According to WCAG guidelines, normal size text should have a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1, and this just ensures legibility. So to achieve this, you can use tools like the Color Contrast Analyzer or WebAIM's Contrast Checker. And these tools allow you to test and verify that your colors meet accessibility standards. A few additional things to keep in mind when it comes to color contrast. You'll want to avoid using light colored text on a light background or dark text on a dark background because the colors will just blend in with each other and makes it hard to read. You want to be mindful of color overlays and transparency effects because that can also weaken contrast. And say you say you're passing that 4.5 to 1 ratio, you should be good. But if you know that the contrast is borderline at meeting that minimum threshold, you can ensure that it's going to be legible just by simply bolding or slightly bolding the text or slightly enlarging the text. That'll just improve readability. And then also, you want to remember that contrast isn't just about text. Elements like lines, markers, and labels in charts also need to be clearly distinguishable because those oftentimes, or oftentimes those elements are just as important. So just by making color contrast a priority, you're ensuring that your maps and visualizations aren't just visually appealing, but they're also accessible to everyone. All right, now let's move to labels. Labels they're critical because without clear, well-placed labels, maps and data visualizations can quickly become confusing. And labels should make it easy for users to identify any key elements without any frustration or confusion. So first, you'll want to aim to keep placement and orientation consistent. Labels should follow a predictable pattern, like being aligned horizontally or placed near the data that they are representing. So this consistency makes it easier for users to scan and process the information in the image. Next, you'll want to avoid overlapping labels. You want to do this at all costs because when text starts to pile up and overlap with each other, it becomes nearly impossible to read. And some things you can do sometimes it's hard to avoid. So some things you can do if you have, dense data sets is to consider strategies like abbreviations or just alternative ways to display the information. So leader lines are one of those helpful strategies and tools that can help with this. They help when space is limited or when data points are, tightly cluttered. Um, and you can actually see an example here in the image on the right. You could, I don't know if you could, yeah, I think you can probably see my cursor, but next to this 140, we've got a little line next to a circle with an X here. So we got these little leader lines that kind of jut out to kind of connect those labels to their icons. So this just helps to ensure clarity without, requiring the user to guess what the label is referring to. So if they're just off-centered a little bit, you can still tell which label goes with which icon. Now, if your map or chart has a busy background, like the one on the left here, you'll want to consider using what are called halos around your text. And a halo is like a subtle outline or glow around the text that increases contrast. And like I said, you could see that here in the image off to the left. We've got Templar Park here. It's in black font, but there's also a white halo around it, and it just makes that black text stand out a little bit more against the blue background that is behind it. So these halos are just helping the label stand out a bit more against the background. So when labels are designed well, they really make maps and visualizations far more usable, far more accessible, easy to understand, and it does add a little bit to the aesthetic, which is most oftentimes what we're going for when we're at first, when we're not necessarily keeping accessibility in mind. We all want our maps and whatnot to look good. But in this case, we're doing all of that, aesthetic and accessibility. So next up is our line styles. And as you know, lines are what help represent key features like roads, rivers, borders. So designing them thoughtfully ensures that they are easy to interpret and distinguish. So the first rule of thumb is to limit the number of line styles you use. You'll want to make sure to try and stick to a maximum of 6 distinct line styles in any visualization because too many variations, like different thicknesses, different patterns or colors, those can oftentimes overwhelm users and potentially make it harder to tell one line from another. Now, if your data requires more than 6 line styles, You'll want to possibly consider breaking the information up into multiple maps or charts if possible, because this can help keep each version focused and easier to understand, especially for users with cognitive or visual impairments. Um, Another important tip is you want to vary line styles by at least 1 point in thickness, because this can ensure that lines are visually distinct and easy to differentiate. So you could also combine thickness variations with different dash patterns, such as solid, dashed or dotted lines to add clarity without, overloading the design. You'll also want to make sure you're using colors with sufficient contrast. Again, there's color contrast again. This will just make the lines stand out against their background. You'll want to avoid overly thin lines, because this can be hard to read on smaller screens, or anybody with low vision issues, make it harder for them to see. And you also want to test your visualizations to ensure that the line styles remain distinguishable in both grayscale and colorblind friendly modes. That's just a little friendly tip there. All right, another feature to keep in mind are symbols. And we've all seen these. Symbols play a big role in making maps and data visualizations easy to understand, and they help users interpret what they're seeing. When it comes to symbols, you want to use intuitive or realistic symbols. Things that naturally represent what they stand for is best, because that'll just help users easily understand at first glance what something is. So, for example, maybe like a tree icon for forests, or you'll use a droplet for water. Um, a droplet for water might make sense for, rivers or something like that. It just makes sense immediately, and it doesn't require any additional explanation. Um, Now, if the user has to stop and think about what a symbol means, then what you picked for that symbol to represent may not be the best choice. So kind of think about that when you're picking symbols. Maybe get with a coworker or something and ask them, does this make sense for this thing? Equally important is consistency in how symbols are being used. So a symbol should always represent the same concept throughout your visualization, or across multiple maps. So if the same icon means one thing on one map, and something different on another, it can and oftentimes will create unnecessary confusion. So you want to just keep that consistency. And some things to keep in mind when it comes to symbols is you want to avoid symbols that rely solely on color to differentiate meaning, because um, users with color blindness may struggle to distinguish those symbols. You also want to use adequate sizing and spacing to make symbols easy to identify. And you also want to make sure your map symbols are defined in a map legend on the map. And we're going to get more into legends here in a bit. But the image on the screen is an example of a symbol legend. So as you've probably already gathered, designing accessible symbols, it does take some thought, but in the end, it's definitely worth the effort, because when symbols are created the right way, they make your maps and data visualizations more effective and easy to understand for everybody. So now let's switch gears to patterns. Patterns on maps are those repeating shapes or textures that can add visual interest and help users distinguish different areas on a map. And when used well, patterns can enhance the clarity, but when overdone, they can create visual noise, and they can make things much harder to read. Um, the first best practice is just to keep it simple and limit the number of patterns that you're using on the map. Um, you want to make sure to stick to one or two distinct patterns at most, because Too many patterns can make the map feel cluttered and overwhelming, which will just make it difficult for users to focus on, the key information or the base information that you're trying to present, or make it harder to distinguish one area from the other. Another important tip is to always use transparent backgrounds when applying patterns, because this allows the map or chart's base information like labels or underlying data to remain visible and readable. So you can see here in the example on the left, you could still see lakes or rivers, whatever's going on behind this beige pattern with diagonal lines. And the same is true for the white version of that pattern off to the left. So stick to transparent backgrounds so you don't lose that base information behind it. Also, when thinking about patterns, some things to consider would be selecting simple, easily distinguishable designs, such as stripes or dots, to avoid overwhelming the user. In this example, on the slide, we're using stripes. Testing your patterns in grayscale to ensure they remain distinguishable for users with color blindness is key. And also pairing patterns with contrasting colors to enhance differentiation while maintaining accessibility. So you could see these two patterns, they contrast from each other. You could tell one's kind of like a tan and the other's just white. So you know what these patterns represent and how much they represent. So by using patterns sparingly and thoughtfully, you can basically effectively highlight data without sacrificing clarity or accessibility. Okay, so now let's talk about background images. Background images are things like satellite photos or detailed maps. And when used correctly, they can add value. They can add valuable text, context to your visualizations, but if they're too bold or distracting, they can overpower the data and make it harder to interpret. So the key is to make sure that you tone the background images down by using muted colors and reducing the visual intensity. So this will help ensure that the foreground data like labels, symbols, and lines will remain the focal point and is easy to see. So as you can see in the map here, in the map example on this slide, the labels really stand out against the muted black and white background. And you can see here they're also using those halos, those that we talked about before. So just using the halos on the muted background really makes the text pop, and even the symbols pop. So everything just kind of stands out a little bit more. Whereas if we were to remove that, we'll just say a white overlay on top of the map, or just that muted color, this text would blend in way too much. So some ways you can subdue the background images are lower brightness and contrast, because this helps keep the background from competing with the data. Desaturate the colors. Muted tones prevent vibrant backgrounds from, stealing the attention away from your labels and away from the information that you're trying to present. And then use selective blurring. A slight blur can soften unnecessary details while keeping the overall context intact. And then always test for legibility. So make sure everything is still easy to read, especially on smaller screens or under different lighting conditions. Again, I would suggest getting with a coworker or getting a second opinion when before finalizing your map. Have them take a look and offer any feedback. Because when done right, background images, they enhance your visualizations instead of distracting from them. So creating a design that's both visually appealing and accessible for everyone is the goal. Okay, so let's shift our focus to headings. because a well-placed heading does more than just title your map or data visualization. Headings are what help users quickly understand what they're looking at, and it improves accessibility for those using a screen reader. So just like in documents, headings make it easier to navigate. Screen reader users rely on them to skim through content and find what they need, without having to listen to everything on the page. And like we've learned from our Microsoft Word trainings, when adding a heading, just make sure you use the correct level based on the content structure. So if the visualization is part of a subsection, you might use a heading 2 or a heading 3, depending on the page's hierarchy. So this ensures that assistive technologies can properly interpret the organization of the information. So the heading itself should act as a clear and concise title for the map or visualization. You don't want to just label your map or chart. You don't want to label it map or chart. The heading should give users a clear idea of what they're about to see. You might want to use a title like average rainfall by region or population density in urban areas. A more concise heading just ensures that that users know what to expect without needing to rely solely on visual interpretation. And at the same time, you're making your maps and visualizations more accessible, which is the main goal. All right, next up, when designing maps, directional arrows are an important element to include because without those, users might struggle to orient themselves on a map. These arrows are what provide a key reference point, and they help people understand how the map relates to, the surrounding area and the real world. So the most common directional arrow is what's called the north arrow, and you could see that example on the right. And the north arrow indicates where north is relative to the map. This simple addition ensures that users can align the map with their mental or physical understanding of the surrounding geography. So some ways that you could use directional arrows effectively are to you might want to place the arrow in a consistent location, such as the top right or bottom left corner in the legend to ensure users can easily find it. You also want to use a clean and simple design for the arrow. You want to avoid any overly decorative or complex elements that might distract from the map or make the arrow hard to see. Also, if the map is rotated, you may not run into this. You probably won't run into this, but I feel like it's worth mentioning just in case. If the map is rotated or it's not aligned with true north, you'll want to clearly indicate this to avoid any confusion. So, like for example, you might include a note like north is rotated 30 degrees clockwise or something like that. So, like I said, you'll probably not run into that. I can't think of many times where I've even seen that, but just in case, you would want to make note of that. So just by including your directional arrows, thoughtfully, you're making sure your maps are more intuitive and easy to interpret for everybody. Okay, now let's talk about scale bars because sometimes knowing where things are on a map isn't always enough. Users also need to understand how far apart things are, and they need to know sometimes they want to know the specifics and the accuracies of that. So a scale bar provides that reference because it helps people interpret distances and get a true sense of the scale of the map. So for example, a scale bar might show that 1 inch on the map equals 1 mile in the real world. That simple visual cue allows users to gauge distances, compare sizes, and put the data into context. So when including a scale bar, some best practices to keep in mind are make sure they're visible. You want to place them where they're easy to find, but you also want to make sure that they don't block any key map details. Um, Also, keep the design simple. You want to use clean, uncluttered designs that are easy to interpret with clear labels for units of measurements like miles, kilometers, feet, whichever unit of measurement you're using. Um, Also, you want to match the scale to the zoom level. So this means that if your map allows zooming, you also want to make sure that the scale bar adjusts dynamically to stay accurate. Um, just to keep those scale measurements accurate, no matter how far somebody's zoomed in or zoomed out. And then you want to test for accuracy. So double check that the scale bar correctly, reflects the map scale, because misleading users defeats the whole purpose of including a scale bar, right? So, um, and as I'm sure you're aware, scale bars are particularly valuable for maps representing geographic areas, construction plans, or any context where distance is a critical factor. So by including a well-designed scale bar, you're making sure to provide an essential tool, I guess, that makes your maps more accessible, informative, and functional. Okay, I think we've mentioned it a couple times. Next up on the agenda is a legend. So a legend acts as sort of a quick reference guide, helping people interpret the design choices in your visualization. So without one, users might be left, guessing what different symbols, what different lines or patterns on a map might actually mean. Symbols and lines and patterns would just be, useless without a legend in most cases. So it should go without saying that adding a legend is important. Uh, the primary purpose of the legend is to provide that key that explains the meaning behind your design choices. So for example, it might clarify that a dotted line represents a hiking trail. Maybe a solid blue line indicates a river, or a green triangle marks a park. Without a legend, these elements, like I said, they just lose meaning, making the map harder to understand for everybody. So to create an effective legend, you definitely want to keep these best practices in mind. Um, Only include what's necessary. If a feature is obvious, like maybe major roads or labeled lakes, you may not need to include those on your legend. Um, Also, you want to make sure your legend is easy to read. So you want to use clear text, enough spacing, distinct symbols so users can quickly differentiate between elements. Kind of just goes back to symbols there, what we learned about symbols. And then you want to ensure consistency. So the symbols, lines, and patterns in the legend should match exactly what's on the map. That includes they should be the same size, they should be the same color and style. Also, you want to place the legend strategically. So a legend should be easy to find, but it should not be in the way. It shouldn't be overlapping any information on the map. Um, Usually placing it in the corner of the map where it's easy to reference, is usually best. Um, a well-designed legend really does help in making your map more intuitive and accessible, because it helps users to focus on the actual information instead of figuring out what everything means. So legend is definitely important. Okay, so now let's talk about alternate text, or alt text, because maps and data visualizations they're not just for those who can see them. Um, as we've learned in previous trainings, alt text provides that text-based description of an image, making sure that people who cannot see the image, such as users who are blind or rely on screen readers, We want to make sure that they can still understand its purpose and meaning and can still access the same information as a sighted user. And that's what the alt text provides. When writing alternate text, the goal is to be concise and descriptive. You want to focus on the essential information the image is communicating. So for example, if an image shows a map of population density, the alt text might describe the key data points, the trends or regions represented, rather than just stating a map with different colors, right? So here are some key guidelines for creating effective alt text. You do want to be concise, so you want to avoid long or overly detailed descriptions. You want to aim for a brief explanation that communicates the core message of the image. Again, you want to be as concise as possible. Sometimes it's hard to do that, and I'll show you an example here in a minute. But you want to also use proper punctuation, spelling, and grammar because well-structured sentences make alt text easier to read and understand for screen reader users. So just as you were writing a paragraph or an email or something like that, you want your alt text, which can't necessarily be seen, it can only be heard from a screen reader, you want it to still read as if you were, writing a paragraph or writing an email. Also describe the purpose of the image, not the appearance. So instead of saying a map with a blue background, you want to describe the meaning as a map showing major rivers in the United States. So for complex maps or visualizations with a lot of information, if possible, you'll want to consider providing a long description or a text summary alongside the map, because this can help users access the full context without overloading the alt text itself. So again, sometimes it's possible, sometimes it's not, based on your situations, but just by taking the time to write thoughtful, useful alt text, you make your maps and visualizations accessible to everyone, regardless on how they interact with your content. So in this image example, we've got a map of Iowa here. And if we look closer, we can tell it's a map of Iowa broken up into different regions by color. We got some labels and numbers in there. There's clearly a lot to describe and communicate here. And one way we can communicate the information on this image effectively is by writing alternate text for it. So, and here's what some example alt text might look like for this image. Again, this isn't necessarily, I don't think you would describe this as being concise, but describing each region kind of gets to the point, and that part is concise. So you could see we got region 1A, region 1C, and you can see which counties are in each. So it's a lot, but you could see, we are noting the different regions, which counties fall into them, and we're also noting the contact person and their phone number for each region. Again, it's a lot of text, but this amount of text is needed to make sure people who cannot see the image can still receive the same information a sighted user can get from looking at that same image. Okay, so by now I think we can all agree that not everyone processes information in the same way, right? So while visuals can be powerful, they're not always accessible to everyone. And that's why it's always important to offer alternative formats whenever possible. And if you're not familiar with alternative formats are text-based versions that present the same information in a way that all users can access. So an example of an alternative format could be it could be a data table or a detailed text description that explains the key points from a chart, from a map, from a visualization, you name it. If the alternative format fully captures the information being conveyed in the image, Then the image itself can be marked as decorative, meaning users who rely on screen readers, they'll be able to skip over those images without missing anything important because they're receiving all of that image information in text-based form. They don't need alt text for that. So, for example, if a map's like details such as regional data or trends are fully explained, uh, then the image is not needed for the screen reader to read aloud. So when creating alternative formats, you'll want to be comprehensive. So you want to ensure the alternative format captures all critical details from the image, including trends, relationships, or patterns represented visually. It really does have to capture everything that the image or chart is saying. You also want to use a logical structure. So for example, a data table should have clear headings, proper row and column headers, and a consistent format that's easy to navigate with assistive technologies. And then also you want to provide direct access. So you want to make sure the alternative format is easy to locate near the image so your users can quickly find the corresponding information. And then offering alternative formats, I just want to say, really improves usability for a broader audience, and it really ensures your content is easier to digest and it just accommodates everyone. So in this example, we've got an image of a bar chart that shows motorhome and camp trailer registrations by year. So the chart, as you can see, it contains 5 different bars representing the years, with each containing 4 different colors representing the types of motorhomes. Um, and like the Iowa map from earlier, there's a lot to communicate through this image. So instead of typing out all of the alt text, offering an alternative format to this image could be best. So if we go here to the next slide, instead of using an image of a bar graph, we could just potentially tell the same story that bar graph image was telling us. We could tell that same story by using a text-based data table. So you can see that the table is still broken up by years and motorhome types, and the user can quickly identify how many registrations each motorhome type made each year. I'll give you a minute to digest that. That's the exact same information as what is on this chart here. And I think that's just probably easier for everybody to digest and not just people with screen readers. Okay, so to wrap up, let's kind of revisit the key takeaways for designing accessible maps and data visualizations. First, always aim to design maps that are as clear and legible as possible. This means simplifying your visuals, limiting clutter, and using thoughtful design elements like consistent labels, readable fonts, sufficient color contrast, and appropriate line styles. Doing all of this will help you work toward your main goal, which is to make the map or visualization intuitive and easy to understand for everybody. Next, you always want to include alt text wherever possible. A short, meaningful description ensures that users who can't see the map can still understand its purpose. For complex visuals, that's when you can go beyond alt text and add a long description or summary to capture the key details that image is trying to give off. And then finally, offer an alternative format whenever possible. A well-structured data table or text summary ensures that users have full access to the same information, even if they can't interpret the visual. So if the alternative format covers everything in the map, the image itself can be marked as decorative to avoid redundancy. So just by following these best practices throughout this presentation, you'll make sure you're doing your absolute best to create maps and visualizations that are, one, accessible, and inclusive, and then two, just effective for all users. Okay, so at this time, that's going to conclude the presentation portion. So we can enter the Q&A portion of this training. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask them. And you could type them in the chat or raise your hand.
Tyler, it looks like we have one in the chat now. How is the alternative format provided? The last example of using a table for the bar graph, or are you suggesting using it instead of? So I think the question is the alternate, in this case, in this example where we had a bar chart and then we had a data table with the same information, the question is, do we provide both, or do we provide the table instead of the bar chart? It sounds like that's the question.
Okay.
And Maggie, feel free to speak up if I didn't get that right.
I think you summarized it well. Yeah, I was just wondering,
Sure.
I work in public health, and so we have a lot of visualizations that we do. I'm not an epi, and so I think while I sometimes review and help some of this, my colleagues, make sure their stuff is accessible. I also know there are those visual learners that love to be able to just scan something like this, and that works well for them. Scanning a table is not going to be as, it goes both ways, but I want to make sure all our bases are covered.
Yeah, exactly. And we usually recommend, if possible, to provide multiple formats. So in this example, if you provided both the bar chart and the data table, the benefit to you as the document author is that you do not have to have alternate text to the bar chart, because that text is there in an accessible, readable format via the data table. And then the benefit to the user is they can choose the way to consume it, depending on their goals and what they're trying to get out of the information. Maybe they do want that visual snapshot, like you mentioned, or maybe they're just like, hey, just give me the numbers, and a data table is more efficient. So, doing it in both ways gives you a little bit of a break from writing some alt text, and also provides the user with the benefit of being able to consume the information in the way they prefer. And I think that kind of leads to Mark's question in the chat here, which is, did you say that the table was easier to digest than the chart? And I think the answer is sometimes for some users. I don't know. I mean, reading charts and graphs is something that, I know is taught in schools now. It's not something we're all great at. So I think it's just a matter of having that information in multiple formats. If someone wants to take this data and maybe they're going to use it, integrate it, do something with it, if it's a table, they can copy and paste some stuff and build that into something else that they're writing or working with. Whereas if it's a chart, an image, then they don't have that access to the information the same way visually. So they can't just grab the information and pull it into something else. So I think it really depends on how the user is using that information, the individual person and their preference for interpreting. So the goal here is to give people the data in multiple formats, and they can really consume it the way that works best for them.
Now, it looks like we got another question. Could you discuss what you would use for alt text for some of your other map examples, like the campsite map or the goose hunting map? The campsite map.
Yeah, and as Tyler moves to that, Mark kind of followed up with it, when the chart shows a trend over time, it's often easier than comparing numbers in a table, especially when there are lots of numbers. For sure. I mean, the benefit of the chart, right, is that we see that kind of visual change over time in a format that is easier to see at a glance, right? So if that is we're not at all saying you shouldn't use charts. I hope that's not what anyone's taking away from this. It's really about providing the data in multiple formats and choosing, what makes sense for your data,
Mm-hmm.
and making sure you follow those principles of design that we've talked about today, as well as providing it in a way where people can choose. So I agree that a lot of times a chart that's meant to show trends, some charts show trends and they don't even have data points on them, right? Because it's really just they're trying to show a curve over time or something like that. So it really depends on what you're trying to convey there. And there are definitely times when a chart provides an easier to understand visual than delving into the details maybe of a table. But again, it's nice for users to have that, make that choice. Sorry, Andrea, back to other map examples like the campsite map or the goose hunting map. So maybe the campsite map, maybe go to that one first, Tyler.
Where was that? Where did I do that?
It is up farther. It's the lead lines. There it is.
Oh,
or
yeah,
labels,
okay.
labels,
There we go.
sorry, with the leader lines. And maybe if you can zoom in a little bit, I'm not sure if it will hold up or if it will get blurry, but just so we can see a little bit better. Yeah, so definitely it's going to be harder. There's some information that is available or more available. It lends itself, especially when you're talking about directions and things like that. So this might have the numbers of these campsites, and I don't have the legend for this map, so I'm not sure what the triangles versus the circles are. But it might start with some description about the direction. So I'm going to assume that this map has a north directional arrow, right? That its orientation is north. So you might start at kind of one end. This is kind of like a long dead end street with a little loop on the side. So you might start at the southeast end of the campground. Our sites 125, 126, and 127. And again, if those gray arrows or triangles meant something, we'd want to explain it. And we'd also want to explain that in that loop are the W and D, whatever those stand for. And then, as you travel northwest, eventually heading north on the road, the numbers increase, and talk about the different again styles. I'm going to say styles of campsites and explain those. So again, it's always going back to what you'd say to someone over the phone. And it's probably not going to be perfect. It's not going to be exactly exact, right? Because unless you have like the data like we do for the bar chart, but to explain the general trend exactly how you would, so whether you start at the top, you start at the bottom, to really just describe what you're seeing as far as, in this case, the numbering of the campsites, the types of the campsites. Christine asks, in your opinion, what are the most common accessibility barriers in maps and data visualizations? Also, can you please link in the chat what is a preferred color contrast tester?
Yeah, I'll get that link real quick.
Okay, here. Thanks. Yeah, there are lots of different ones. You can kind of choose what works best for you or what's easiest for you to use. Some of them need to install things on your computers, which you may or may not be able to do. So I would say the most common accessibility barriers are really just getting that same information or data. And all these things about design are important, and they definitely can make your maps way easier and data visualizations way easier to understand. But really just having access to the information. And if you think about an end user who's maybe viewing some of these types of maps or data visualizations in a PDF document, For example, just the biggest barrier is just not having explanation, or having things simply labeled, campground map or something like that. So a lot of times that's what users are experiencing now, or do not have, they just have no information about what is there. So I think that any alt text is better than no alt text, right? And obviously follow the design principles, but any alt text is better than no alt text. And I think we can constantly work to improve that. And I know Tyler mentioned something about talking to people, and we've talked about this before with alternate text. It's not a science. It's a little bit of an art and a science, right? And I really think working with your coworkers, working with your department, or whatever subsection you're in, to kind of standardize some of those things so that people know what to expect. And I think that Cesar made a really important comment in the chat here, saying that who the user is very important in all of this. I think a lot of times with maps and data visualizations, we have, you've got very different groups of users, right? You might have folks who are citizens or residents of your county or your state or whatever, who are trying to get information about some kind of service, or just information. Then you've got media, right? A lot of times, reports and chats or charts and graphs are designed for media, for people who, for legislators who are trying to get information to make decisions. And then sometimes they're more internal, right? So it is very important to keep in mind who is viewing this, and who might be viewing this. So that's a good point, Cesar. I'm glad you mentioned it. Anne mentioned, oh, she doesn't have access to the color TPGI's color contrast analyzer or checker. Okay, and looks like Tyler, I might be a little bit behind. Tyler also added a link to the WebAIM one. That's an online one that doesn't get installed. So, or maybe Anne, you put that one. Someone did. There are tons out there. You can find them pretty much wherever. So as long as you can find one that you're able to get to and use, again, you just want to be better than 4.5 to 1 color contrast ratio. Mark asked, was it recommended that all labels have the same orientation? Yeah, I think, and I don't think that we need to take it quite as literally. Like for a street map, you want obviously the east-west or west-east streets to have a horizontal orientation, whereas you'd want your north-south ones to have a vertical orientation to follow and connect with the lines of the streets on the map. But I think what we want to avoid is having more than that. Like, you don't want some weird, maybe you've got a map with streets and then you also have some buildings or something like that. You wouldn't want those to be like diagonal or weird or something like that, right? So you'd want to stick with just kind of those two orientations. You don't want people to have to, twist around or try to figure out what's where, and then also be careful of the overlapping as well. But yeah, as simple as possible. And yeah, in the example of a street map, it makes a lot more sense to have two orientations based on the direction of the road.
Okay, it looks like we hit our, our hour mark here, so we won't keep everybody, but if you guys have any other questions after this, again, we have office hours on Wednesdays. Feel free to come to those, bring all the questions that you've got related to accessibility. Melissa and I are there, and we'll do our best to answer those and guide you guys in the right direction. All right, so I think we'll go ahead and end this this session. Again, every Wednesday we have office hours, so we definitely would love to see you guys there. Thanks for joining us.
You bet. Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.